And welcome, everyone, to this special live episode of the podcast Revolutions in Retrospect. And this podcast is where we look back at the histories of the revolutions that changed. Okay, pausing myself, muting myself. That remade the Atlantic world. So I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, and joined with the other host who we have on the podcast, Dr. Jim Ambuskeas.
Hi, Len. It's great to be here with everybody. We're looking forward to talking about Ken Burns' six-part series on the American Revolution, about 12 hours and some change to talk about this evening. And we're excited to talk about what we thought about it, what we thought worked well, what we thought didn't work well, but more importantly, what our audience out there would like to ask and what they thought about the American Revolution, the series by Ken Burns on PBS. And to do that, we are very delighted to be joined by our good friend Adam McNeil, fellow historian, recent PhD, all around good guy, also a podcast host on the New Books History Network. Adam, welcome to the program and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first off, definitely got to say thank you for having me. This is an amazing way to kind of cap off a fun-filled year of 2025. And let me see. So the work that I do primarily is looking at Black loyalist women in broad retrospect, but especially those from Virginia, who were the largest group of women who left British occupied New York City at the end of the American Revolution. And so now I'm working on the book, which is a crazy thing to say in the same year I defended. Now I'm working on the book. So when I saw the documentary that it was on the way out, I made sure to go to, when I moved here to Charlottesville, Ken Burns and some of the other folks on the director team came down to Charlottesville for an event. I think it was July 3rd, right before July 4th. And from then on, I was like, oh yeah, I definitely got to see if I can get involved in some kind of way. And so I received that from Jim. So thank you.
You're
You
welcome.
fulfilled spoken dreams.
We'll all
That's
get
what
there
we do.
someday. Yeah.
Literally,
We
like, hey,
fulfill
y'all,
dreams.
y'all, for sure.
So, for everyone watching, if you have questions, comments, or anything that you want us to talk about regarding Ken Burns, The American Revolution, you can just comment on the comments page for YouTube. Scroll down, comments. But until then, we'll just sort of chat a little bit until we see some questions coming in. So, I thought what we could do is give a brief overview of our thoughts on the documentary and starting with what we think worked well. And so, for me to start, one thing that I absolutely loved about the American Revolution was the use of maps. And I think that you had the use of maps in his, of course, seminal The Civil War. That's the one everyone knows. I think that's what a lot of us who were born in the 20th century, we we remember the Civil War
Wow.
from Ken Burns. And so, that's sort of what we hold everything up to. And so the use of maps and GIS systems, which is what is it, it's geographic information systems, in order to explain particularly military aspects of the revolution, really helped me out a lot because it gave terrain, but it also showed where everybody was, where the troops were. Because for me, once you start talking about flanks and going around and then cutting them off, my eyes go a little fuzzy because I'm not a military historian. But I feel like the use of maps were creative, but also helped to explain things that I don't think words could for someone like myself and other viewers who aren't big on military movements and things like that. So I really liked that aspect of the documentary. So, how about you, Jim? What was something you thought worked well?
I thought what particularly worked well was, and this is kind of the goal of the documentary in the first place, which is to kind of expand our horizons about what the revolution was. I mean, if we had seen this documentary 50 years ago, it would have been about Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and that's about it. So around the time of the bicentennial, and there's actually a lot of great books by colleagues like Michael Haddon who have written about the bicentennial era and how Americans remembered the revolution in that period. It was very much on the founding fathers. So, women weren't really part of the story at the time. Indigenous nations certainly were not. Enslaved and free people of color were not. And so we began to see on the screen, and I think it's just a first step visually, although historians have been writing about this for a long time. But I think the audience got to see a more expansive view of the revolution as the people themselves actually experienced it. And I think that's important because, it's not just about the 13 colonies. It's about the 26 colonies. It's not just about white Virginians like Washington and Jefferson. It is about people like Harry Washington, who was enslaved at Mount Vernon, or it's about the Haudenosaunee, who are thinking about a war of independence in their own right. So I think we had a more capacious view of the revolution than we would have seen 50 years ago, and I think that has got people talking. Adam, what about you?
So for me, there are a lot of different things when I try to think about what kind of stood out. Um, and so for me, one of the parts that I found the most fascinating was, first of all, once again, as someone who's coming out of a graduate program, you're steeped in all the historiography, you're steeped in your specific corner of the American Revolutionary world. And so sometimes it can be hard to, because you're at eye level with it. But then in a documentary that has narrative structure, that still has an argument, but it's organized a little bit differently than what your manuscript is going to look like when it goes to press, right? So for me, entering it, I had to take a step back from my eye view level and think about this from the 30,000 foot level or the mile high level. And what it helped me to do is, for one, kind of as I'm sitting in for 6 nights trying to think about, what are my opinions, I always have to take a step back and remember that if I'm a casual observer or someone who is just generally interested in history, that this documentary can likely speak to that experience in ways maybe a book can't, right? And that's where, you have the sea of historians and other thinkers who contribute, right? So that's kind of step one. But then step two, I'm also thinking about it from the standpoint of the things that I know should have been in if we were talking about this kind of documentary. So to cut to the quick for me, I've been really thinking a lot about the Battle of Yorktown and thinking about it from a particular Black experience where this could have been that point. And someone told me in the chat, or on YouTube, if maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but this would have been to me a perfect opportunity at the Battle of Yorktown to say that in this American Revolution, you had Black people on each quote unquote side of the war. James Lafayette as a character, I was quite surprised didn't play a more prominent role. Because, he is this important, spy. You connect him with Lafayette, you talk about these lofty goals, you talk about 1787, right? Not long from, we celebrated the anniversary of that a few days ago, of him getting his freedom or through manumission, but also to think about how does this man articulate his own experience? How does he articulate his experience, and not only an experience in the war, what he did, but also thinking about it from the standpoint that he's looking at Black people, right, on the other side. If you read his actual petition, he talks kind of derisively about quote unquote Black loyalists. And so once again, that might be me stabbing my previous statement, number one, in the heart in a way by virtue of that statement. But for me, to round the corner here, to me, the documentary was, to your point, Lynn, if you are someone who, is enthralled with maps, this was a phenomenal space. This was I think that overall, if I had to give it a grade, I'd give it a B, right? Because I think ultimately the way they started in kind of parts of number two, and we can get to this, but then the middle ones, like two and three, I almost lost it. Not because I was necessarily mad, but because you have it was to a certain degree almost exciting might be certain, maybe a little too much, but the battle scenes kind of brought some element of excitement, I'll say, but then there was a lot of lulls.
Right.
But one last thing, who to me caught my attention and to me was not surprise, but was the star. You wanna know who? Christopher Leslie Brown.
Oh yeah.
Amen.
Because there was a moment in episode 2 where he's talking about Dunmore's proclamation, and let me tell you, he had this section where he just paused. I thought my YouTube TV was buffering. Right? I literally thought my YouTube TV was buffering, but it was just because he was pausing, right? When he was talking about the kind of paradox of Dunmore's proclamation. We can get to this a little more, but those are some of my general thoughts about the documentary and thinking about it from different vantage points and different
Right.
points of view.
Yeah, I could listen to Christopher Brown read the phone book. And he's
And
a
his
great
book,
historian
I
and he's
mean,
got a great narrator voice for sure. But I think Adam, your points get to something interesting that I think speaks to some of the things that didn't work well, right? Which
hmm
is, and we've all three been involved in podcasting. We've all three been involved in documentaries to certain extents, and so we come at this both from the historian standpoint, but also from the creative standpoint. And for me, Adam, to your point about some of the issues with episodes, 2 or 3 or whatever, the some of the struggles I had with the documentary is the kind of what we would call pacing, right? And I think a concrete example of this is in episode 1, where there was a race to get to Lexington and Concord. The 7 Years' War is fought in 15 minutes. The imperial crisis, the taxation on stamp tax, paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea with the Townsend duties, which are barely mentioned, the Tea Act in 1773. Those are covered quite briskly to get to the quote unquote shot heard around the world. And for me, I think that was a kind of indication of larger issues throughout the entire documentary, where episode 1 covers 21 years, episode 2 covers 12 months, and it is hard, right? It is hard to juggle all the competing narratives, to get all the sources in, to think about how you're going to tell the story effectively. But there was a real mismatch, I thought, between certain episodes, or actually even all the episodes, where there didn't seem to be a kind of unified vision where that would kind of structure the entire series and effectively pace through the history. Um, Instead, I think in certain moments we got a very rushed history where we needed the time to build up to a war of independence, because the 1760s are not inevitable. And I thought, we needed greater treatment to explain why British Americans begin to doubt the validity and the sanctity of the empire, such that by April of 75, a war actually begins. And so I sympathize with this entirely as a creator myself. I understand how hard it is to contain a narrative and to piece it all together. But there were certain moments where I thought, what's going on here?
right. And to speak to Adam's comment, which makes me chuckle a little bit, he says that it's in the battles that there's the excitement. And I thought there was way too much military and battle details. I did personal. Um, I felt like we were letting go of some of the precursor to the actual war to focus on military strategies that could have been explained quicker, did not need the level of details that it had. And I think that made it feel a little too much like it was inevitable. I don't feel like you get that workup of, are this is treason. Are we going to go against the strongest empire in the world? We're colonies. We don't have this big military. And you don't feel that tension because it feels so inevitable. We're saying, oh, all this happened and this is why, and here's the war. And at that same time, and I can't believe I'm saying this, is I didn't feel like it was violent enough. And to explain,
Yeah.
for me, seeing any kind of war documentary, I never want it to be romanticized. If you watch a documentary on war and say, "Oh, I wish I could have been there. I wish I could," then you're missing the point because war is hell. And I felt there was not enough violence as how the war was, because even if they talked about something violent, then we went to a letter that was, very romanticized, and, I would give my life for my country. Well, sure, but let's talk about your family members who are now missing you because you were just killed. And in that same way, there were some good uses of violence. I really loved that they explained what tarring and feathering is, because I
Mm-hmm.
feel like it's something you kind of chuckle at and you say, oh, they look like a chicken. But you're talking about, you know, boiling hot tar being poured on your body, sticking to your skin. It is a very violent act. And the same with when they talked about Mary Campbell and her experience of being
Mm-hmm.
assaulted by the British soldiers. And then my thought goes to, but that also happened to the enslaved people all the time. So you have this individual, and it's sort of, you get that visceral feeling, and you don't get that with the enslaved people and what they're dealing with. And I think that's what kind of struck me, is that violence was peppered in there, but it still had an overall positive view of the war. And the outcome may have been good, but I think that whenever you sort of romanticize or um, create heroes from a war, it goes against what we're really trying to do as historians, which is to educate the future and to warn to warn future
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah, and also to think about it from the perspective, right? Because you talk about the violence, I think about Maya Jasanoff had a really
Mm-hmm.
good a bit. I think it was very early in the documentary where she talks about, I believe, episode one. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, like when we think about war and we think about war, and bloodshed, that's a Civil War story, less obviously American Revolution. But it's funny, Lynn, that you actually mentioned that, because if I'm not mistaken, there are moments in the actual documentary where they're trying to gesture at it,
Mm-hmm.
but seemingly it wasn't as strong as it needed to be, because you even have this case, and other people have written about it, but I came to know it through Lauren Duvall's article. It was in one of I can't remember which book. Was it Women Waging War?
Mm-hmm.
I believe, but where she talks about this black loyalist woman in Philadelphia
Mm-hmm.
who was sexually assaulted alongside another white woman in British occupied Philadelphia. And it, to your point in terms of the nature of not only violence but also the specific kind of gendered violence that's occurring. And but it just makes you think about the narrative choices, right? Because I even think about it, to your point, Jim, as people who are creatives, but also people who narrate history in different mediums that are similar to documentaries, in the sense of, your podcast is, you're doing like the long, I think you're episode 21 at this point,
Right.
right? And so thinking about what can you do in a 12-hour documentary versus insert, this, how many hours
Mm-hmm.
we're at with your, documentary. And, and so in one way it gives me, more, what's the word I'm looking for? It gives me more, I guess, understanding. But that understanding also comes with the fact that, like, you've been in the game for 40 years, right? So it's not, this is not a new kind of thing. And, there are a lot of, questions going from Civil War forward about the narration of black experiences and I guess non-white, elite experiences. And so for me, I did want to think a bit about, and I have done a bit, thinking about what role, because although we're talking about quote unquote both sides of the war and the many different multifocal, points of view within the war, ultimately this is a story about patriotism. And you know that because if it wasn't, we would have stopped in 1783 or at least 1787 or 1789. But we don't end there. That last 20 minutes or so, we're going all the way to modern social movements.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But there's a there. When look, let me. I'll step back. When you are on CBS Sunday morning, and you say that the American Revolution is second in significance to the birth of Christ, you don't have to be a card-carrying Christian to think that might be a little too high. Because if you put it second to the birth of Jesus Christ, that kind of gives you obliged to do anything, does it not? Because ultimately, like, it's in the justification of goodness.
Right.
Well,
That's a
it's
real great point.
interesting. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is the revolution as we remember it versus the revolution at the time. So, thinking about, let's take the Declaration, for example. What's important for us today is the preamble. When in the course of human events, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That is a kind of to take the religious invocation there, Adam, kind of creed that we hold to ourselves and try to achieve. And that was very clear in the beginning of the documentary. There was a kind of I think on episode 1 there was a kind of zoom in to the preamble, right? But in the 18th century, to the point of many scholars like Steve Sarson and Rob Parkinson, who's got a wonderful book coming out about, both of them have a wonderful books coming out about the Declaration, as well as Emily Sneff. What matters to them in the 18th century are those charges against the king. So that, that's their revolution, right? Our revolution is the one that, in a sense, and I think this is the kind of message at the end of the documentary, that never ends. It's ongoing. And, in many ways it shouldn't, right? Because Lord knows we've got a lot of work to do. But then you kind of have to be sort of think thoughtfully about the framing. And as we were thinking and talking, in this round, I wanted to come back to a question that somebody had asked us on social media in the run-up to our conversation today, which was about loyalists. Adam, you invoked patriotism, or maybe that was Lynn as well. The idea that the way that we remember the revolution is about capital P patriots waging war against a tyrannical British king. What Bernard Bailyn, a very famous historian, once called the losers, or the loyalists, those who did not rebel for whatever reason against the king, or eventually, hanged up their patriot hat and rejoined the British fold during or after the war. They, in recent years, and particularly the last 50 years, have become a concrete part of the story we tell. But they are a complicated group, and I mean, we're not only talking about white people, but we're talking about indigenous people and free and enslaved people. So, to the questioner's kind of question, how should we think about loyalists?
Right.
What more could have been done in the documentary? What did it do well? And who are these people that for them loyalty was the default option, not rebellion?
Right. And I think that speaks a little bit to what I said previously about it feeling like it was a foregone conclusion. Because if you walk into your research saying the revolution happened and it was right and we won and here we are, then anyone who did not think that immediately looks like they're on the wrong side.
Mm-hmm.
Because they did not have all of the information that we as historians have for obviously the outcomes of the war. And we're talking about treason. We're talking about, we're not talking in saying, well, let's write some pamphlets and, see if we can get some things changed. We're talking about individuals who have to not only rethink who they are, their identity, but also how they're going to take on this powerful British Empire. And we're talking economics, you know, politics. It's not just, slavery, huge issue. It's not just about a war and breaking apart. There's so much more to it.
Yeah, Adam,
Yeah,
let
and
me
I
kick
think
it to you.
about
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because I believe you're involved with a project centered around the great historian Benjamin Quarles, who wrote a really important book about Black people in the American Revolution. And I was struck by a comment that he had written in that book, which was pertaining to loyalism, that African Americans weren't fighting for a place, they weren't necessarily fighting for a people, but they were fighting for a principle. And I'm wondering, with your important work that you're now transforming into a book, how do you see enslaved people and free people of color making the calculations that they did during the conflict to figure out whether it's best to side with the Patriots, whether it's best to side with the British, whether it's just get in the Great Dismal Swamp and try to wait it out?
Yeah, it was, kind of going back to how I started with the James Lafayette comment, because you had so many people who were at the Battle of Yorktown that had been with Cornwallis for, by that time, in October or so of 1781. Many of them had traveled through the entire Carolinas up to Portsmouth and then going over to Yorktown. And so the reason why I bring that up in the invocation of the question is because the Battle of Yorktown was really it was a climactic experience for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but of different degrees. Right, going even back to the violence part. I remember compiling a long document of day by day all of the writings, memoirs, and such that I could find that were marked for that time. And oh my gosh, you just find so much death, destruction, body parts, smells, right? You kind of like, you maybe not don't see it, but you can understand. You have all these body parts laying everywhere, right? Going from the summer to now, you can imagine what that was like. And it made them have to then think about what is their quote unquote loyalism, or what does their loyalty, right? Take away loyalism and just think
Mm-hmm.
about loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, no matter what label you want to put on it, if you attach yourself to a particular military in this war, that means that there's a modicum of loyalty that you have in some way, shape, or form, no matter how you put it in terms of degrees. But I thought the treatment of people of African descent, and it was okay. It was okay. And the reason why I say okay is because if I'm sure that there were more stories of probably newer individuals. If Phyllis Wheatley and Mum Bet and Crispus Attucks are the triple New England, right? Right. We're starting in New England, or we're staying there, right? A Judith Jackson at the end in New York City, Francis Tavern.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm actually quite surprised they didn't talk about Colonel Ty more. Maybe I missed that. When you talk about violence, that's your man.
Oh,
Now, whether or not he actually got to Dunmore in the Chesapeake, I've always found kind of dubious, because I've never actually found a document that actually says that. But, that I can kind of put that to the side. But I felt that the treatment of Black people was okay. And the reason why I say okay is because I don't really know, even now having watched every episode, I don't know where Burns sits. Because in a way, the closest thing I can come to it is Burns is trying to, right? It's the modern day parlance of Black history is American history. It is, but it's not necessarily in the way that is in the national sense, right? This is a 1619 problem, right? In the sense of a 1619 project, in that if you read the entire thing, right, and not just Nicole Hannah Jones's piece in the beginning, this is a story about American patriotism. It's about, you know, it's about black people in different ways wielding that American flag and everything that comes with it. And in a way, the closest thing I can get to, even in the sense of black loyalists, right? Because their struggle, quote unquote, comes because of the war for independence. And so for me, it's an okay treatment. And but this is how I'll end. I always wonder about when you have information, like effectively when you center an individual narrative in a documentary of this, how how much information, right? So we see Jackson in Francis Tavern. We see her child taken away from her by Jonathan Auerbach. But how much information about this person went behind the creation of her as a character in this broader story? Because to me, and once again, this is the problem of the individual knowing a certain amount. Then you start to see they use this part of the petition, but why not this one? And it's my way of saying Jonathan Auerbach was a Scottish loyalist merchant whose brother-in-law previously owned Jackson. And we know that because John McLean put in a runaway slave ad for Judith Jackson 10 years before in May of 1773. So that you could talk a story about loyalism, black versus white, white ethnic identity in terms of the amount of Scottish slaveholders in the Tidewater, and in particular Norfolk and Portsmouth. And thinking about when you're talking about Dunmore's proclamation, you're having all these black quote unquote freedom seekers going on these boats. Who's also with them? The enslaved folks bound by these loyalists. Not exclusively Scottish, but a significant, a significant population.
Yeah, especially
right?
in that
so
area.
Once again,
yeah.
it's a exactly you of all people know this, Jim, right? And so
Yeah, got my
not
tartan on
not
right
to
now.
yeah, I was gonna say right, and like I said, not to go too long on this, but it does a bit trouble me because in a way, even with people like a Harry Washington and others who they were quote unquote on the other side, I still feel like even in their discussion, it's still talking about this grand narrative of patriotism. And I'm not telling our listeners and our viewers that they need to be on one side or the other, but it is something to think about that at the end of the day, when you put this at the pedestal of number 2 to the birth of Jesus Christ, you're trying to tell the American public about themselves in a particular kind of way, especially because the public broadcasting is the one who it's traditionally the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the other funders are also the ones that are getting hit right now with a lot of the censure and a lot of the austerity measures, right? So I think Burns and his team are trying to tell a particular patriotic narrative, but I'm still a little troubled in terms of how black people and also Native Americans, because he also talked about how he wanted to have Native Americans begin and also bookend the series.
Right.
So,
Well, I mean, I think it goes to show, right, like just how difficult it is to tell a very complicated story. Particularly when I think in the public's imagination, you're accustomed to one that has a kind of straight linear path, but then you begin to introduce, rightly, right, all of these different elements. And just to take one cheap example, right, the fact that we think of the so-called 13 colonies that become the United States, but there's really 26 in British America by 1775. And you sort of think about the entire, let's call it imperial ecosystem. How does that change the perspective? And then, Adam, to your point, if you're thinking about, all right, what are the Haudenosaunee doing? The Six Nations Iroquois, and until 1763, they are the most powerful people in Eastern North America. That changes at the end of the 7 Years' War, but they are the arbiters of the balance of power in this part of the North America in that period. You've got the Cherokee and any number of other nations like the Delawares and the Miami and whatnot, they are too making calculations. How do you grapple with all of that? And sometimes as a creator, right, that works successfully, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily either. But another audience question that's come in is actually about kind of along the same lines that we have been talking about, which is the people who are kind of caught in the middle, trying to, not necessarily trying to stay out of the way, but trying to prevent the outbreak of a war to begin with. The question essentially is, what do we know about people who are trying to prevent an imperial civil war from breaking out in April of 75?
Well, I think that's a great question, Jim. And honestly, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I think everyone who's gone to graduate school for history in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, was the Laurel Thatcher Ulrich Midwife's Tale.
Mm-hmm.
And although it starts near the end, or after the revolution, you read this book, and it's about a frontier woman and her economic hardships, her everyday sort of domestic duties, and it's absolutely fascinating what and her big drama has to do with patience, or losing a child. But then you take your step backwards and realize this is when they were writing the Constitution. And so it's important, I think, to realize that not all Americans were all together, sort of either agreeing with each other or even battling and saying, loyalty versus rebellion. But there were people who were just trying to live their lives as well, because they weren't in Philadelphia and they weren't in New York. And so it was more about just surviving. And I think their story is just as important in showing that this wasn't a cohesive American citizenry. Maybe not use the word citizenry, because then we're talking about the white males at the time, but it wasn't a cohesive nation. And I think that also helps to speak to this feeling of inevitability, or this feeling of sort of the hero,
Mm-hmm.
the hero worship of the American Revolution.
Yeah, and it makes you think about when you're telling a tale about how 13 colonies became an independent nation. You have your grand narrators of that story in terms of the people who were most active in it, and or whose experiences were very much wrapped up in what the outcome of the war was. But I take this question to also think about those people who, right, you're just using the term surviving. Because to this one about inevitability, no one knows when this war is going to end.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right? Because I think the documentarians pointed out the war, and maybe this was after the Battle of New York, but in reality, it was a fight of attrition. Mm-hmm. How long will the British remain fighting? And what that does is, for me, when I think about those who caught in the middle, there are just some people who, many people, probably you would say the majority of the population of the entire 13 colonies, and obviously not just the 13, because I'm from Florida, so we're talking East and West Florida as well. Not only did they not know when the war was going to end, second of all, they also they wouldn't actually know when and if the war would ever come to their doorstep.
Right.
Right.
Because, for example, in Virginia, in reality, if you're, for example, if you're in this neck of the woods in Charlottesville, the war is really going to hit you, like the actual war, not just people who are more so, their particular experience is more so of like It is a part of the wartime experience, right? So I've done some work in the Winchester area, right? So we know that there were Quaker exiles there. Not necessarily that, but the actual physical military. I shouldn't even say the military doesn't hit you until 1781, but the war has been going on for 6 years by that time. At this point, you're just trying to survive because when the time the British have come, like May 1779, tobacco stores, naval stores are being outright just bombarded. Not only 1775, 76, but also 79. So in reality, a lot of people are just trying to survive, right? And they might not actually have a perspective, patriot or otherwise. In reality, their lack of a choice, almost in a way, maybe can put them on the quote unquote patriot side, because ultimately they're not leaving. The Betsy Ambler aspect, I felt like she was also a star of this, which I found really good, because of her, the way that her family moved, it made you think, oh my gosh. And then you get the Great Wagon Road and such. And so I felt like those are some areas where the people, quote unquote, in the middle, and maybe not in the middle, but people whose experiences were not necessarily exclusively tied to, I want such and such side to win. I thought that they did pretty well with that one. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting thinking about geographic proximity to the fighting. I mean, I'm kind of, this is before the war starts, but it reminds me of this letter that James Madison, actually, down the road from me in Orange, when he's a young man, he's at Montpelier, and he's writing to his college friend, kind of very cranky that the Washingtons and those ilk in 74 are not moving faster to oppose the British. And you read that and you think, well, it's Mr. Madison, it's because the British warships can easily get to a place like Norfolk or Williamsburg. They cannot get to Orange County. And so, the people in the House of Burgess or in Boston or in the New York Assembly or in Charleston, they may not be entirely happy with what's going on, but they're not going to poke the bear unless they absolutely have to. And so you've got this kind of interesting generational and geographic divide that's playing out. And it actually kind of dovetails into a question somebody has asked us about the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a huge part of this war. And the question essentially was, why was the Caribbean so significant to the British, such that, by the time the French enter the war, the British are really thinking about, oh God, we have to protect this space. Anybody can take it.
Adam, thoughts?
Yeah. No, I can chime in. This is the space where Vincent Brown really was, just going
Right.
and doing his thing. But right, it's always interesting the people that get to kind of play different roles. But the reason why the Caribbean is so significant in this is because in reality, right, we talk about a place like, the black majority of South Carolina, but you have 1,000,001 black majorities in the Caribbean that are much more economically profitable and more important to the vitality of the British Empire. So that's really stands out as number one. But also, this is when the British Empire is being stretched in terms of not only their material resources, but also their imperial resources in reality. Because, right, you're trying to protect, once the French come in, now you're trying to fight on different fronts, right? Not only Gibraltar, you're also fighting as well, obviously, in the Caribbean. And so, in reality, this is also goes to the point about that I made before about this being a war of literally attrition, right? You see this in the American Civil War generations later, where it's really a story of how long can the public go
Yeah.
before they've reached their boiling point. And you see this with Lord North when the actual treaty negotiations are going and what ultimately becomes of it. And so, in reality, the Caribbean plays an important role because ultimately they are the crown jewel. Jamaica is the crown jewel. But then you have Barbados and the other colonies. And so, in reality, what this is about is, right, and I think Vince Brown talks about this, 13 colonies are certainly important, but they are not so important to continue and drag the war on, even against the push of a Lord Dunmore who returns to the story in 1781 and 82, trying to rise another Ethiopian regiment, but even bigger, to retake Virginia and put him back. Well, he probably knows about this time that's in Richmond and not Williamsburg, but he wants to return to his seat of power that he ran from and abdicated, in 75.
Thinking about an excellent question that a colleague of ours, Julia Gaffield, who is an expert on the Haitian Revolution, mused about during the showing of the documentary. She said, and I agree with, she said, I'd like to see a 6-part documentary on the Haitian Revolution. So the question
Yes.
I think I have for both of you, and for folks out there, we still have plenty of time for questions, so please do pop them into the chat. But as we're thinking about the importance of revolutions, as we're thinking about the importance of documentaries as mediating the past to the present, if you had the ability to make a documentary, what topics would you choose?
Oh gosh, Jim.
I'll start. I'll start, Lynn, on this one. So first, I would actually start with Paul Cuffey.
Mm.
Because to me,
Yeah.
when I think about the kind of figure that he was,
It-
he is a part of the American Revolutionary story in terms of his petitioning with, I believe, his sibling in the 1770s. But also the fact that he's going to Sierra Leone. He's right. So I feel like you have so many different characters that you can bring into the story. You can bring in Massachusetts. You can bring in the Colonization Society and all the people that are involved with that in the early American Republic era. But you can also, there was a point, I think, where his entrance into the Chesapeake in Maryland causes a huge stir because this is a black man leading a maritime fleet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that do in a place with so many enslaved people like Chesapeake, Maryland? So I think he would be a fantastic figure.
Well, Adam, and just briefly, remind us who Paul Cuffey is for folks who may not know his story.
Yeah, so Paul Cuffey was an Afro, and I'm probably gonna actually, I'm not gonna, 'cause I actually don't know how to properly say it, but he's a Afro Native American
Mm-hmm.
from Massachusetts down, I believe near the Martha's Vineyard area, and he was, like I mentioned before, he was someone who was actually a fairly well-off financially individual, him and his family, but he then becomes a major maritime worker in New England in the post-revolutionary period, and even leads a Back to Africa movement in this particular time frame as well, and becomes early adherent of colonization as a political strategy for Black people. And so, for me, his identity as a Afro-Native individual, but also someone who straddled a lot of different political fences, I think would be fascinating. There are a number of others, but I'll lastly even say um, I'm very surprised. Phyllis Wheatley Peters,
Hmm.
like documentary, biopic, what have you. I think that would be a fantastic one. And I can't just leave here without also saying, my advisor's book, you know what I'm saying? Own a Judge, never caught. I think that would be a fantastic one, and she's even in Hollywood. So.
Lynn,
So those are
what's
my
your dream
three.
documentary?
Well, I think that what has been fascinating me for a long time that I feel is just we don't see here is the viewpoint from the British side. And the reason I say that is because even in Ken Burns' documentary, we hear of things that the British are doing, that the colonists were also doing, that the American soldiers were also doing. They were also assaulting women, but we don't talk about that. And so my dream is to take sort of a, if you've seen, what is it, Making a Murderer? And you know how you see
Oh,
this one whole story and you're like, yeah, that they're innocent or they're guilty. And then you see the other one, like, oh no, they're innocent. Is that I want a the viewpoint, a full viewpoint of from the colonist perspective, from the American perspective, and then I want a full one from the British perspective. I want their propaganda and their rhetoric and what the individuals and the citizens and the everyday taxpayers there, what they're thinking about it. And then I want to see those too, and I want to truly look at it from both perspectives to understand what was really going on, because I feel like we've only gotten the hooray for the American Revolution narrative, which is completely understandable where we live. But I personally would love to be able to step into the shoes of a British school child. And although
mm-hmm.
they don't even talk about the American Revolution, to them it's not even that important. But I would like to know from that vantage point. So I want like my Making a Murder, but it's like making a revolution. And I want with the two sides and to see how they stack up against each other.
Adam.
A late edition, Harry Washington,
Oh,
as well,
absolutely.
because I
Absolutely.
think considering once again he's actually born in West Africa, which shouldn't ever be forgotten, but also right he did the full term, right, going from being born in Africa, being trafficked to the Americas, to then who would ever know that your enslaver would become George Washington, right? He was George Washington then, but the George Washington of that time meant nothing to his national and international standing thereafter. So I think like that's, but then also obviously as this, person who ended up, being literally enslaved in the Great Desert Swamp, and then joins the British, and then remains with them, effectively for the entire war. And then, you have your Canadian story, and then you have your Sierra Leonean story. So to me, like that would be such a fantastic person. Or I have another one. Someone who was not in the documentary and I thought was absolutely reprehensible. It is very hard to have a segment where you talk about what the British may do in terms of freeing enslaved people and only have the story in Dunmore's, Virginia, when very publicly, very bloody, very fiery, literally and figuratively, you have Jeremiah, right, who is down in South Carolina, enslaver himself, probably one of the most wealthy black people in all of British North America, who allegedly stoked the flames of revolution in the Low Country.
Mm-hmm.
William Campbell, royal governor, is saying, y'all are crazy. This is not real.
Right.
Literally tried to stop him from being burned at the stake, which they literally not only hung him, but they burned him in South Carolina. That to me, and maybe I might have been conflating documentary with like biopic or something like that. But to me, going even back to the actual documentary, I thought the narrative choices say effectively in the Upper South, as far south as you go, in terms of the discussion about the impact of, and this goes to even one of the questions about how does slavery as a term get used, was insane. Because South Carolina and Georgia was where you had the greatest hyper concentration of enslaved labor.
That
Obviously, more than Virginia.
that's a fantastic point. Thank you so much, Adam. And we're running low on time, so I want to quickly throw something in that instead of being discussion may have to be more of a little bit of a snack for the audience to chew on until we do our next live, perhaps. Myself, I work with Primary Source Media, and we work on documentaries as well. So we're working on what, Ken Burns is creating and what other documentarians are creating. And something I noticed, because this has been my everyday, is that, first of all, you don't have the amount of images for the revolution that you have of the Civil War. Obviously, we did not have photography, but quite a few of the images that were used were maybe 19th or 20th century images. They had some historical inaccuracies peppered in because they were after the fact. They were lovely images, but maybe not the best representations, not entirely historically accurate. And what is the other aside to that? What is the solution? And the one that I feel like we've all been debating is this idea of creating CG or AI images.
Mm-hmm.
And the AI in history, very big topic, whole nother podcast. But thinking about, would we rather use these historical but not historically accurate images that don't truly reflect that particular time period? Or are we comfortable with technology attempting to recreate with a historian's hand guiding it? And I think that there might have been a little CG or a little AI in there for Burns. There were some things I said, that there were some ships. I know there was one where they were looking at a port and all these ships. They did not, they didn't recreate that. So I don't know where some of them I feel like they
Wow.
used some technology for.
It's an
So,
interesting question. Oh, Adam, go ahead. I'm
yeah.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say real quick, I would say negative to the question. I would rather the inaccuracies only because I've seen where an institution, the McNeil Center a couple years ago, when they had their Ben Franklin, um, they had, you have the pig of knowledge and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they had the Franklin lectures to pub it up. I
Mm-hmm.
think David Walsheiser was like the first one, inaugural. They had a CGI or whatever. They had an AI version of Ben Franklin sitting in a movie theater with a pig and an audience of, yeah, it was insane. They had, I think they might have had, I think it might still be on there. But like that is actually the one reason why I say no. I will take the inaccuracies from here to infinity and beyond because that was crazy and not in a good way.
I mean, it's a really fascinating question because we, Lynn, as you rightly point out, for our colleagues who study the mid 19th century onward, where there is photography, where there is other sources, and increasingly into the 20th century audio sources, you can begin to recreate the landscape or the sonic palette, as we might say in the podcast business, of past worlds, but we can't do that in the 18th century. And it reminds me of a comment a medievalist made to me at a conference. Even thinking about reconstructing the medieval past in a podcast, which you can do right by storytelling, by building the world in the audience's head, but then it becomes more difficult in visual form. I think as you're suggesting, is whether or not the images that you are showing on screen, even if they are made decades after the event, if they are evocative of the event in the ways that would have been true to the history, then it seems like that is probably okay. But then, the AI emergence in recent years is both troubling in some respects, right? For reasons that we can talk about on an entire different podcast, but then also kind of compelling. Because what if we could, based on material cultural evidence, based off of maps, based off of descriptions, rebuild a landscape or rebuild a person to a high degree of accuracy? Where are the ethical boundaries there? I mean, is that okay? And or do we do a disservice to the people of the past by doing that, or are we better serving their stories by using alternative methods? to tell them. I think we're going to be debating that for a long time, but I think those are going to be compelling questions going forward as folks are trying to make documentaries like the Ken Burns series and like Primary Source Media and like the History Hit Network going forward. And we'll see where it lands in about 25 years.
Absolutely. Yes. Are we creating good history in the same way that the people in the 19th century were creating history about the American Revolution? I think is what it boils down to. But we have run out of time, so I want to thank everyone so much for being here with us today. Jim, always great to have my co-host.
Always a pleasure.
Very excited to have Adam. Thank you so much. We wouldn't
Yes.
mind having you on another podcast sometime.
Yes, I would love that. And can I also say one more thing as
Of
a parting
course.
shot? Just to let folks know, because I'm always pubbing things, and this is not self promotion, but a promotion of someone who's a great scholar. Just got Lauren Duvall's The Home Front, so please y'all go buy this book. It's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the best new books you're gonna read on the American Revolution and women's experiences, especially in these occupied territories.
Co-sign that argument.
Absolutely. We love that. Selling good history is what we do. And hey, why not check out Too Complicated for History podcast while you're at it, right, Jim?
Exactly.
And take out the Primary Source Media YouTube page and see everything we've got. But again, thank you all so much for joining us for this live recording of Revolutions in Retrospect. We'll have the recording of this up on YouTube for Primary Source Media, but also it will be, if you want to hear our other episodes, they're available wherever you get your podcast. They're also available on YouTube. Come out every other Tuesday. So we got some really exciting guests and new and different ways to look at the revolutions in the Atlantic world. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. And Adam and Jim, thanks so much to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Hi, Mom.
Bye, everyone.